When I was a young art student, I was asked by one of my instructors if I would be able to explain to him what I felt drawing was, and in that conversation, how I could also explain to him what the elements of drawing are. I found this to be incredibly difficult and challenging, and ultimately really wasn't able to effectively do that. At that, he gave me the opportunity to try to do that. He then gave me his explanation that had been passed on to him. And what it was something called the tetractys. The tetractys is a mystical concept of drawing that dates back to the time of Pythagoras and has been passed down by word of mouth for centuries throughout the art schools and kind of a word of mouth tradition. Pythagoras lived somewhere in the neighborhood of around 570 BC to 495 BC. No one knows the exact dates for sure, but he was known as the first great and true philosopher. There was a group of people that then really believed in Pythagoras and his teachings and his interest in so many different aspects of life that they later formed a secret religious society known as the Pythagorean sect. The Pythagorean sect for the most part, consisted of philosophers, mathematicians, writers, musicians, artists, basically all great thinkers from all walks of life. They were very interesting in exploring and experimenting and researching all sorts of elements that they felt were interesting. Most people are familiar with Pythagoras because of the Pythagorean theorem, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. For artists, and in particular people that are interested in the art of drawing, the tradition that was passed on was a mystical concept explaining each of the elements of drawing in a format known as the tetractys. The tetractys basically is a decad. So we have a decad which consists of 10 points in the form of a pyramid. The first row, the first dot, the first point is known as the monad. The second row, which has 2 dots, is the dyad. The third row here is the triad. And then we have in the fourth row is the tetrad. All 10 points make up a pyramid, which is known as a decad. Like many other mystical concepts that came about through the potentially Pythagorean sect, the tetractys had multiple meanings and addressed multiple references to various forms of thinking. The tetractys itself could also represent the 4 ages of humankind, the 4 seasons, the 4 directions, fire, earth, air, water. And it also had meaning where it was representational of what was known as the harmony of the spheres and the cosmos. So the monad here could also represent unity. The dyad also represented power. The triad also represented harmony. And tetrad, which was the number 4, which is a very mystical number within the Pythagorean sect. Number 4 and number 10 were very powerful numbers, also represented the cosmos. But ultimately what we want to talk about here is how would the tetractys address the various elements of drawing and explain the process of drawing in a very clear and concise way. This was sort of an epiphany for me and really made sense, and I hope it will have the same impact on you as well. To begin with here, we'll take the first row of the decad, which the first one is the monad. And the monad, as we talked about earlier, represents unity. And the thing to think about with this is when you begin the drawing process, what is the first thing that one would do in order to draw? If you were living hundreds of thousands of years ago. Possibly you were in a cave and you picked up a piece of charcoal and you decided to capture the animal spirit. The first thing you would do is take your charcoal and apply it to the cave wall. So all drawing essentially begins with a point. But once you remove your point, what you are left with, it is no longer a point. What you're left with is either referred to as a mark or a dot. The monad essentially is the first and simplest element in visual design. By definition, we can't actually draw a point, since to see one would require it to have some form of dimension. Therefore, when we remove our point, it becomes either a dot or a mark. So we have a point, we remove it, we have a mark or a dot. That is the simplest element of visual design, and that's important to remember. In order to begin your process of drawing, you have to start somewhere. You begin with a mark, you begin with a dot. Then we drop down to the next row here on the decad, which has 2 points of reference, and this is known as the dyad. Dyad also represents, in the harmony of the spheres, represents power, and this is where we begin with line. Line starts to create something that is recognizable. Ultimately, how I would define line is a continuous mark made on a surface by a moving point. The marks that span a distance between 2 points create a line. So we'll go from here across, and now you can see we have a mark that spans 2 points, and that creates line. We move now on to the third row of the decad. This is known as the triad. In drawing the triad, we, just like over in the area where we have the monad, we begin at the point. Now I'm going to draw a line that spans 2 points. And very much like we have here in the dyad, we also have just a line here as well. We have a mark that spans 2 points. If I continue this on and I go across this way, what we have here is we still have line. We have a mark that spans 2 points and it continues. I can then continue on this direction, this direction, this direction, this direction, and keep going on into infinity, and it will continue to be line. What our goal here is in the third row is to begin to create shape. So if I come down like this, and then I connect that, and I come here, and I continue my line, but then I head up this way, and I connect here, I have now created shape. And what I like to use as a description for this, it is a 2-dimensional area, meaning it's a flat plane. It's a geometrical shape, and it defines an area in some way. If we go back here to this where it's just line, it is not defining an area. It's just a continuation of a point. And here, our mark comes down, goes across, then returns back to the area where it originated, and it distinctly defines an area. There are 2 types of shapes that I like to reference, and it is geometric shapes and organic shapes. We will talk further in a later session about organic shapes, but this is now what we have is a triangle. So we began with a point, we removed it, we are left with either a mark or a dot, whichever you choose to use as your explanation. Then we came to the next step, which is the dyad, and it's a mark that spans 2 points. We began with line, came across, and then enclosed it. So we clearly defined an area that created a shape. In this particular case, a geometric shape of a triangle. Next, we come down to the fourth row, which is the mystical magical number of the Pythagorean sect. In this step here, we are going to try using the tetrad. We are going to try to create form. In my opinion, and from my perspective, the most challenging and intellectual thing to do in the fine arts is to take a two-dimensional surface, draw a three-dimensional surface on it. I believe that is the most challenging thing in all of the fine arts, creating a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. There are other elements in other forms of the arts that have other challenges, but intellectually speaking, I believe the most challenging thing is to create a three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. And so doing that here, we're going to start the same way. We start with a point. We are going to have our mark span a distance between 2 points. We will continue our line. And if we were just to go to here and stop here, this creates an interesting scenario because we, as of yet, just to further explain the concept of shape, at this point, we have not fully completed the shape. This still continues to be line. Once I connect this to here, we now have shape, and we have fully defined an area. The next step is utilizing the complete section of the decad. How do we make this become actual form? We want it to be three-dimensional. This up here, the monad, which is just the mark or a dot, has no dimension. When we get here to the dyad and we span the distance between 2 points, that is referred to as being one-dimensional. Once we've done that here and then defined an area, making a shape, we now have a two-dimensional shape that is a flat plane. It is not round, it is not sculptural. The ultimate goal in the arts is to try to create something that is three-dimensional. So I will take this corner and I will go here, and we'll connect this to the last remaining point. And at this point, we have a shape and we have a line. It's still flat. We still have a triangle. This is not connecting anywhere, so it's very much like the dyad, and it is just line. Now I'm going to connect this here. And this makes an interesting case because as of yet, it is not three-dimensional. You need to add lines with inside of a shape to make it become three-dimensional. But at this point, what we've created is just another shape. So we have this shape right here. It's two-dimensional. It's flat. It's still rectangular. And then we have this shape right here, and right here. So that creates an additional shape. And technically, we still have the overall view, if you look at this abstractly, of the triangle. So we have just those shapes. We do not have as of yet, we do not have three-dimensional form, which is our ultimate goal. In order to do that, we're going to connect the last line right here. So now we have created a series of shape that creates a three-dimensional form. What this is a tetrahedron, or in simplistic terms, referred to also as a pyramid. And it can be a pyramid seen from the top looking down or from the bottom looking through to the top. It creates an interesting optical illusion. So again, we started off with a monad right here, then the dyad right here, the triad, we drop down to the third row. And lastly, we had the tetrad. And to clarify, the monad represents the mark or the dot, using your point to begin the process of drawing. The second row here was the dyad, which is line. It's a line that spans, it's a moving point that spans 2 points. So we start here, our point moves, and we span an area between 2 points. And next we have the triad, which is a continuation here of line, and then enclosing it so that we clearly define an area. So we have a geometrical shape, it's flat, it's two-dimensional. Lastly, our goal was to use line, continue the line, we created our shape, and then we started to work with inside the form. That's the key here, is to work with adding line inside the form in order to create a three-dimensional form. So you're adding this line within the shape to create form, and that is the ultimate goal in drawing. If I were to just continue to add other lines outside of here, it would only be adding line. If I took another area and I enclosed it, I would then add a shape. So for example, if I do this, I take a center point here, and if I continue and I do this, and then I do this, I've just now created a series of shapes, and I've taken away some of the sculptural effect of the pyramid. And you can continue to do that. We could even run another line through here. And if I do this, and I do this, I've now created another shape. So now it's starting to take away the feeling that it was sculptural and three-dimensional. And now it's creating a whole series of just flat triangular geometric shapes. So we'll go back here again, just so that we can see the pyramid without that explanation. Going back to the middle, back to the middle, and back to the middle. And again, now we have our pyramid. So here we have pyramid, or can also be referred to as a tetrahedron. And so now we have the mark or the dot, the line, we have shape. We went through and referenced how to make this a three-dimensional form, but then added additional shapes so that we have a whole series of additional shapes. You can still see inside right here, and we'll increase these the dots in the corners just so that you can single that out a little clearer. So this distinctly is the three-dimensional pyramid that we have then added some additional shapes on just to further investigate the concept. And this is the dyad. This here was the triad. And this here was the tetrad. So that basically the tetraktys, which was passed down for centuries originated more than likely in the Pythagorean sect, not necessarily by Pythagoras. No one knows for sure, but in all likelihood came from the Pythagorean sect. This mystical concept of tetractys fully explains the elements in drawing. There are other elements that we will discuss later, which deal with shading and composition and so forth. But for purposes of just what is drawing, I feel this is one of the best explanations I've heard to explain each of the elements of drawing, beginning with the point, removing it, and leaving a marker or dot, continuing through to line. Then your goal is to form shape. And from shape, your ultimate goal is to create something that's three-dimensional. So you want to move from the mark to line to shape to three-dimensional form. If you were drawing, for example, maybe a lion or a human or a portrait of the figure, it's very helpful to be in with a very light, loose line. Then you want to start to look for recognizable shapes to simplify the form that you're drawing. And once you get to a position where you feel that's fine and you want to start adding the articulation of anatomical achievement to use your create something that's more three-dimensional using articulation and the anatomical structure, you can then start to add and work within the form to create something that's very realistic. That is the challenge. Look for simplified shapes, add anatomical structure to help create form. And that will, if you can learn to do that, it will serve you well, learning how to draw and perfecting your craft.